pinkwashing of imperialism, or in the case of Israel, Zionism, or, you know, colonialism, or whatever ism you want to attach to that. And I think it's created this kind of weird problem. I was seeing some discourse the other day from some other individuals talking about this pride parade that was taking place in the States that was like attended there, like many pride parades. There's these big corporations now that have floats, and there was a float from Lockheed Martin as well. And then they were criticizing this socialist organization for participating in this pride parade, suggesting that they were somehow like co-signing or agreeing with or wanting to stand alongside these big weapons manufacturers that are kind of like co-opting this pride event. And I'm just interested, like, to hear from you, Dan, as you're in Tel Aviv. You mentioned Tel Aviv Pride. If you have any insight or thoughts on that, about the ways that, you know, in many ways, it has been kind of sinister in some ways to have these big corporations, or to have, you know, states like Israel co-opting this kind of rainbow imagery or pride messaging in order to kind of obscure this kind of like colonialist violence that they're participating in, or this kind of apartheid that we see in Israel. And I think the question that I have is like, where do you think the line is, and how do you think we should stand kind of against that kind of pink washing of imperialist violence, and also at the same time stand with people in the LGBTQIA plus community who are under this like direct assault right now from these very reactionary forces who are, you know, engaging in this campaign of this anti-trans hatred, framing trans and other queer people as being groomers and pedophiles. Like, it's a really important moment that we stand with these communities and support them. But how do we separate that support with also recognizing the ways that these powerful entities are kind of co-opting this messaging in order to pinkwash their own violence?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't think there's a super easy answer. I think in the same way that big one for you. Corporations or states have fully like co-opted pride and, you know, support their employees. You know, they've also developed, you know, ESG funds. They've created, you know, vast corporate, you know, diversity schemes to, you know, just completely wash over all kinds of evil stuff that they're doing, you know, behind the scenes. And I think, like, I mean, on the one hand, it's useful to point out that hypocrisy and, you know, show that, you know, giant banks, giant investment firms, weapons manufacturers are simultaneously lobbying and funding right-wing politicians who are working diligently to curb, you know, people's rights to all sorts of things. And I think, like, you know, there is something like deeply sickening when, you know, you see photos of people, you know, in pride marches, you know, from, you know, the 20th century, and you see like the vitriol and the hatred of people in the crowds, and you see the fact that like there was a time when this was like really scary and not state or corporately sanctioned, and did represent this like putting your body on the line in the middle of the street where anybody can get at you. To sort of show support and community. And I don't know, it's hard. I remember like a pride event, like a parade in Portland, Oregon, and like being like pretty sickened by all the corporate sponsors. But then also like there being kids who would like come out from like the boonies in Eastern Oregon, you know, who are in like deep conservative, you know, Idaho borderlands. And they were like, oh, this is still our shit. Like, this is still the biggest group of, you know, LGBTQ people we've seen, you know, in our lives, and this rocks, Raytheon and all. So, you know, it's hard because it's all mixed up that way. I think there's something particularly perverse about it happening, you know, in Israel. I think, you know, that image definitely stuck in my mind of like seeing, you know, Arab workers building these like, you know, basically, you know, like towers. And then also having, you know, tons of like European and international tourists come in to, you know, this city that, you know, is built on the remnants of Palestinian towns and villages. So yeah, I mean, it's it's brutal. It's twisted. I think you just have to scream at all sides at the same time. But it's hard to stomach. I'm not sure exactly what the answer is.
That Lockheed Martin float was in D.C. and them, along with other military contractors and corporations who don't have a pure ideological commitment to protecting and defending the LGBTQI plus community, are always in this parade. You have to wonder why they're welcome to begin with, especially when these companies donate every cycle hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more, to anti-LGBTQI plus Republicans, because those people are more likely to do their bidding when it comes to increasing the military budget, which ultimately a lot of it flows back to military contractors, Lockheed Martin included, but ultimately would fire people if they needed to, or they got in the way, if they were, gay, lesbian, trans, whatever. These companies, through their donations, not just get money back in terms of contracts or an increased budget, they also protect these people and continue helping to elect people who want to make it easier to, again, fire these people who are peddling this groomer pedophile conspiracy about members of the LGBTQI plus community, are pushing all of this trans kids in high school or middle school sports bullshit that results in a story we saw this week where two grandparents stopped some elementary school track meet to have some 9-year-old's genitals inspected. That is fucking insane.
Yeah. In Canada, by the way, in case anyone thinks that this is only happening in the United States, this kind of panic that's been going on led by the far right.
Yeah, this culture war has spread across borders and is largely funded by these companies. In many cases, a lot of dark money flowing to these groups. I know, Dan, you did a story on Chris Rufo and his group, and he's really been one who's pushed this type of bullshit. And a lot of companies and special interests are funding that operation. Ultimately, it's a distraction. That type of stuff is a distraction that keeps people pointing fingers at each other rather than focusing on what these companies are doing to make our lives worse.
But I also think there needs to be blame laid at the feet of the liberal politicians who, open up their offices with rainbow buttons, for Pride Month, and then completely fail to provide any sort of economic platform that works to shut off the culture war. Because the entire point of the culture war, if you go and you look at Rufo's statements to the press where he's being candid, right? His whole point is that he drinks some of that Kool-Aid, but he's also extremely intentional in the fact that if we weaponize this shit, nobody's going to ask questions about anything else. If we can attach the term critical race theory, if we can attach the term, what does he call it? Curriculum transparency, so that every time people hear those words and we tie them to a bill or a measure that's going to completely rat fuck poor people, but their brains are overwhelmed with that fear that we've instilled, then, we can push it through. And the way to fight that is not trying to wage a counterculture war. Democrats are terrible at doing that. They're not killers. They're not able to compete on the same plane. And so I think there's also a conversation that needs to be had about how liberals and Democrats are also, complicit in this by, crying crocodile tears at the terrible things going on in state legislatures through the country and completely failing to put forward any hard political solution to end it.
Yeah, I mean, you have the Biden administration, putting up pride flags in the White House and saying things like, if you're transgender, then I stand with you and everything. And I don't want to say that's nothing. It's not nothing, these kind of gestures. But at the same time, while they're making these kinds of empty gestures, I say it's not nothing, and then I describe it in the same sentence as an empty gesture. But at the same time, though, while they're doing that, there's trans kids being taken away from their parents right now in Florida. And what is Joe Biden and the Democrats meaningfully doing to address that? What are they meaningfully doing to address this panic that's taking over, where, teachers and doctors or parents or anyone that's even remotely interested in providing this sort of gender affirming care to trans kids are being framed as criminals and pedophiles? What is the Joe Biden administration doing about that? Not really anything. All they really have is this words, and they want to get credit for standing with these communities by using the words. but they don't seem to be willing to like expend any political capital in meaningfully defending these groups that are under attack right now.
Yeah, I think like, you know, a lot of stories that haven't been written or made it into the national press in the way that they should is about the total breakdown in state Democratic parties, whether it's New York with the total bloodbath that happened in the midterms, whether it's Florida, which is just like a complete and utter clusterfuck of incompetence and broken bylaws and just old ancient people, you know, holding on to control in state parties because they're total psychopaths. And it's like some shred of power in their miserable lives to sit on a Democratic state committee and just drive it into the ground. Or Massachusetts, which I reported on several years ago about how the state committee, you know, worked with the DNC to completely screw over a young insurgent candidate, challenging Richard Neal, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, who's used that powerful seat to just completely screw over Americans over and over and over again. So I think, like, you know, another thing is just be like a national politician who actually understands, you know, hammering the DNC, hammering the state parties into actually becoming effective, you know, organisms in the way that the right has capitalized on. You know, you look at what they've done in you know, state houses and election boards, you know, all up and down state politics, and it's extremely effective. Democrats can't hold a candle to it.
That Richie Neal race that was against Alex Morse, and that was a good example of how, like, young, I would say, well-meaning young people fell for the weaponization of language and words and societal issues by the Democratic establishment. What happened, and obviously you could speak to this in much greater detail since you reported on it, but for people who don't remember, Alex Morse, again, the progressive challenger to a very corporate Democrat, was accused of impropriety in his role as an adjunct professor because he added somebody, I think, who was also a student at that college to his close friend story on Instagram, which college Democrats there, who later were revealed to have ties to or wanted to work for Richie Neal, accused him of something that they said was something that is signaled or demonstrated intimacy by adding someone to their close friend story on Instagram. And people then accused him, who Alex Morse is gay, and you can see parallels to how people talk about gay people on the right, calling them groomers. They accused him of all sorts of nefarious behavior. Ultimately, it was all just totally a sham, and they just totally smeared this guy because he dared to challenge this corporate Democrat.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that shows how, like, sometimes the way that the cultural excesses of the right often work directly for them and benefit them in a straight line, and sometimes the cultural excesses of the left, you know, are completely self-sabotaging and defeating. And I mean, I want to talk about, like, Richie Neal, like, filing your taxes. Have we seen this? Have we heard about this? Like, Richie Neal is the guy who makes it impossible to file your fucking taxes. They were going to create a free version. The IRS was going to create an easy, free way to file your taxes so that you don't have to pay fucking money to TurboTax and Intuit. And Richie Neal I'm pretty sure he took more money from Intuit than anyone else. And then he just shut that shit down. He just, like, can you imagine the campaign ads if a Democrat made it easier to file your taxes? Can you imagine what that would do for Democrats' odds, you know, countrywide? And what happened? This guy got completely screwed. His challenger got completely screwed. Jim Roosevelt, great grandson of the President Roosevelt, was the legal counsel coaching these kids on how to set up the smear campaign. Some kid wanted to intern with Richie Neal, who was part of the whole setup. I mean, just crazy. I mean, fortunately, I saw Alex actually recently, like a year ago maybe. He got out of there. I mean, he's now basically mayor of P-Town, so he's sipping pina coladas on the beach. He's doing okay, but you know, the rest of the country is not.
Yeah, and just to circle back on how we started talking about this, I just think that, like, there's been this kind of interesting reaction that's happening as corporations have started to weaponize the idea of, like, social. They've kind of tried to absorb and weaponize this idea of, like, social justice or racial justice or whatever, diversity, and then you see these big banks and the intelligence community. The famous, like, there's that CIA ad from a year or two ago. Like, I'm a neurodivergent millennial with anxiety or whatever, and join the CIA. or the way that these intelligence communities or banks or weapons manufacturers or states like Israel have tried to like co-opt this kind of message and absorb the energy from these social justice movements in order to like, you know, pink wash their agenda or their history. And, you know, that's led to the right framing these huge massive corporations and banks and fucking Disney as being these like left-wing radical organizations, which is preposterous. But then you also have this reaction from the kind of like a certain segment of people that I think identify with the left that now think that to care about social or racial justice, or to care about LGBTQIA plus issues or Pride Month means that you agree with these big institutions, and that it's somehow now liberal to support these things. And it's, and, you know, it's somehow, you know, something that we should be pushing away from, and we shouldn't be supporting these communities, and we shouldn't be talking about these things, which I think is pretty preposterous on its face as well. So it's just kind of interesting how this very cynical co-optation of this sort of social justice-y language by these big corporations and weapons manufacturers and states has led to a reaction from both the right and with people that identify as the left, who have now twisted themselves into this ideological kind of pretzel to be like, the way to be on the left now is to not support any of these social justice issues and to actually reach out to these sort of right-wing communities that agree about all these things, which is just a nonsensical, incoherent position to have, I think.